Hi, great to see everybody. You're all muted, so we can't hear you yet. Welcome, welcome, welcome to our first of our Lighthouse Sessions 2021. Just saying how great it is that we can do this with people who are far away. And it was kind of like something that we, like many people, did starting last year in the pandemic. And I just love that it's going to become a tradition for us. So you've had a moment to look at the screen. This is not a webinar. This is a Zoom call. So we can see you and we can hear you, and we want to see you and we want to hear you. If you make inappropriate noises, we'll mute you, but otherwise we do want to hear your fantastic voices. I probably don't need to say this to you lot, but please do participate. Lots of chat, lots of questions. And we've scheduled this meeting to run for an hour and 20 minutes. We didn't want to close it tight on the hour. I think we often find that's just not enough time. So we've given ourselves a little bit of room to go over if we want to. And I think what we want to try and do with these sessions is introduce you to people and ideas that are just that. I want to say certainly people who've inspired me and just given me so much stimulation and thought and something a little bit out of the box. Sometimes people who aren't from the library sector directly, of course, which is the case with lovely Panthea today. And just, bring something that's kind of like really, really outside and help us to have a kind of higher level engagement and conversation with each other. So, Panthea was recommended to me by the fantastic Anthony Zakharewski from Democratic Society, who many of you have met, when I was asking for somebody that we could engage with on the question of collaboration and on, rebuilding community through collaboration. And I had some fantastic conversations with her. And not least, when I was doing a bit of research on her, I came across a fantastic video of her talking to a legend in the field of collaboration, Adam Kahana. And if you've ever come across his book, it's called Collaborating with the Enemy, How to Negotiate or Help to Negotiate with People Who Don't Get On. And the fact that Adam would be consulting or discussing with Panthea on this question really tells you something about the level of expertise and knowledge that she has. We're so lucky to have her today. And she's speaking to us from New York. I don't know exactly where you are in New York, Panthea, but we're lucky to have you. And what's going to happen is that Panthea is going to introduce herself, make a short presentation. I'm going to lead off with a couple of questions. And I would encourage you, if there's questions or thoughts that already come up in the chat, do bung them in there. And then we're just going to lead off into a conversation, see where it takes us, and wrap up. Remember, this is being recorded, so you'll all be able to pull it back, and we'll probably write up some quick notes and share some bits and pieces. Any questions, throw them in the chat. I'm lucky to be sitting opposite my fantastic colleague team. So between us, we wish you all a great session, and I'm delighted to hand over to Panthea.
Thank you so much for having me. Really, really wonderful to see all of your faces. I think it's such a joy to be able to just see everyone when you're doing these, just to be able to have conversation. And so in the spirit of this conversation, really encourage all of us to feel free to chime in the chat. I'll try and keep an eye on it, and just to jump in, unmute, whatnot, where and as would be helpful. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Give me 1 second. Can everybody see that? Yes, thumbs up. Fantastic. Okay. So today, I was really excited when Alana reached out because I'm sure, as all of you hear all the time, when you reach out to people outside the library sector, we are all very excited to be talking to librarians. I think all of us have, this is my public library from when I was growing up. Very fond memories. I won my first sort of teen writing contest here at the age of 13, and that sort of set me on a path. And so I think, what I wanted to talk about today was to really offer just some reflections, some provocations, some opportunities that I see in my space, which is, democratic renewal, civic participation, and community organizing, to see where and how there might be opportunities for synergy, for sparks, and for reimagining the world that we desperately need. And so with that, yes, just the caveat that I am a huge fangirl and so honored to be here. I sort of bombarded Alana when we first started talking just about all my memories and possibilities about library and library spaces. And I think that spending so much time with Mrs. Clenahan, who helped out an immigrant kid that did not feel comfortable in Canada where I was, I felt very isolated, I was bullied. And so I think this is a huge, just a really important space for me. And all the time sort of burrowed in reading speculative fiction and historical fiction, and really set me up on a path to become a journalist and an ethnographer, where I wanted to collect stories of my own. And I started traveling around the world collecting human stories on these sorts of issues. So I started an organization 11 years ago working on issues of governance, international development, human rights. And I, went to countries to collect stories for institutions like this: governments, UN agencies, international agencies, nonprofits. And, they sent me to nearly 40 countries to collect human stories and hopes and aspirations, and to bring them back to places that look like this and to places that look like this. And I provide that context because, after about 15 years in this space, I started sort of young, naive, and angry. And I'm still sort of young, naive, and angry. But, working on these sorts of issues, I think what I saw over time is that, frankly, we weren't doing a lot. We talked a good game about the type of change that we were making. I've launched presidential initiatives, brought activists together from all around the world to, launch new efforts and new programs and new, initiatives and but at the end of the day, I realized we weren't doing a lot that was really structural, that was really transformative. And you know what? The public knew it. You take a look at statistics around, this is US data, around level of trust in our public institutions, in our governments. And we are at about an all-time low here. And you take a look at what's around data from around the world. And I don't know if you can see the legend down there, but to the question, how much do you trust your national government? The trends aren't very, the trends aren't very optimistic. And I think after, in the last few years, I've been in a bit of an existential crisis stage where thinking about, the type of work that I'm doing, bringing together activists and communities and governments to make change. What is it that we're really doing? And for all the good that we're trying, are we making any difference? And it brings to mind this quote from Ronald Reagan: the most terrifying words in the English language are, "I am from the government and I am here to help." And so this set me on an inquiry around where and how do we create spaces that can actually bring us to the type of structural change that we need. Because my observation was that coming from, I'm just trying to pull up the chat, coming from, do librarians see themselves as activists? It's a really interesting question. Coming from the space that I was in, being commissioned by and working with and partnering with quote unquote powerful institutions, power meaning concentrations of economic and political power, were we making any change? Because when the solution set is coming, or when the parameters are being defined by government, by the World Bank, by international agencies, by the major NGOs, they're always, I would venture, be too incremental, too narrow, too marginal, and too slow. And so the question I've been grappling with is, what does democratic renewal actually look like? And where and how can we actually get there? And just for a bit of context, I think that, in the spaces that I play in, think tanks and nonprofits and community groups, when we talk about democracy, we often talk about it in terms of, integrity of rights and free and fair elections, and political scientists have sort of a list of characteristics that we think about when we describe democracies. And in the past few years, there's been a lot of talk about democratic backsliding, right? Especially where I'm based now in the US. This has been the big news, the big headlines. But we tend to think of democracy as a spectrum, as it were. So are we strong or are we weak? But I think of democracy actually as a 2x2 of sorts. So there's a line here, which is what political scientists and journalists talk about, but there's also a sort of y-axis here. And what we often talk about is democracy at the top, as it were. Democracy is backsliding at the top. We have captured elections, we have money in politics, but we're not often looking at what is happening, quote unquote, at the grassroots within our democracies. And at a community level, from what I've seen, it's actually been incredibly vibrant. And that's, I think, a story that we're missing. But this became very clear in the last year. So this is a map from near the start of COVID in New York City, where I'm based. And the neighborhood that I live in, Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, is sort of in the sort of center bottom there. Basically, it was hit really hard by COVID. It's a predominantly Black community. And this is, when it's non-COVID, this is what it looks like. It's incredibly vibrant. You might know it as, home to Jay-Z, Lil' Kim, Biggie, a lot of incredible culture and vibrance coming out of this neighborhood. We were hit really hard by COVID. Food insecurity, unemployment, people were really struggling. And as you all may have seen, in US, the government response was appalling. Now the US is buying its way out of the pandemic, but that's a separate story. So what happened at the start of COVID was that a bunch of I wouldn't even say self-described activists, but people, neighbors, started putting up flyers and saying, how can we help? What do you need? Can we get you anything? We recognize everyone's struggling. What do we do? And what happened was an incredible effort over the last year. We just had our sort of celebration party on Sunday. Where it was an incredible mutual aid operation where people came together. And I also saw this happening all over Europe with friends there, neighbors coming together to help neighbors, delivering essential medicines, cleaning up the streets, buying groceries, getting people vaccine appointments. And as someone who's always worked in the social and public sector, what shocked me was that the systems that we were developing for intake, for managing of these, were frankly far more sophisticated than any, I wouldn't say any, that's extreme, were far more sophisticated than most public sector efforts that I have certainly worked on. And this was stood up in a rapid amount of time. What this says to me is that there is a lot of energy and talent and resources that we need to harness from communities, from neighbors, from civil society that we often don't do. And we'll get back to why that is shortly. But, just for a quick snapshot around why I think the example in my neighborhood is significant is to date, we now have about 5,000 members. We've served about, I think these stats are a little old, but at least 10% of the neighborhood has been covered with some sort of aid. We raised over $1 million for our community fund at a time where many people had lost their jobs and were economically struggling. But we pulled together. And I think what pulled my heart was so strong that I took a leave of absence from my work. I took a sabbatical for a few months to really focus on efforts like these and other community organizing efforts. Because what I saw in government and in my day job was this set of behaviors. There was a lot of denial. There was a lot of blame. There was capture of funds. There were, frankly, bungled responses. I think, you all may have seen in early days of the pandemic here, it was kind of like a Hunger Game of sorts, where people were bidding and competing with each other for PPP. And this is sort of, violent late stage capitalism with a social infrastructure that that is ineffective. And I know you all come from different countries. And so, I think the experience of COVID is unique to each country. And this is certainly not the case everywhere. But what I did see was a lot of asking of this question. This is from Ori Okolo. She's an activist, philanthropist in Kenya. What is a government? And these were some of the responses that she saw on Twitter. A species of the leech variety, the strongest, most organized gang in a territory, a business, and do we even need one? And I think that in the US and I think around the world, we started, coming out of, and during COVID, this is last June, outside the Brooklyn Museum. The library is about a 5-minute walk away. So everyone loved the library. No one was protesting there. They were all gathered in front of the museum. But people coming out and sort of protesting the fact that we live in a society that doesn't recognize our humanity, that doesn't protect our dignity or our joy. And this is the Black Trans Lives Matter protest last June. And people were saying, it's enough. We're tired of asking for monuments that are affronts to our basic humanity to be torn down. We're going to do it ourselves. We're going to organize with one another. And I think that, I think there's a comment here, I often associate activists with polemic, marching with a loudspeaker, sort of doing these type of actions. But I think there's lots of ways to be activist depending on where we are situated. And this is something I'm really interested to explore with you all. But people wanted to take power into their own hands. We were tired of begging government. We were tired of begging nonprofits. We were tired of, frankly, working with the institutions that I work with, because we saw that traditional ways of public agenda setting were totally flawed, totally broken. We recognized that we need structural solutions, and we were no longer satisfied with government and businesses setting the agenda, and then communities fighting on the fringes for crumbs. And so this led me to an inquiry last year, and with many partners and comrades and colleagues, who should be responsible for which sets of questions around reshaping our future. Right now, I think often what we see, kind of almost like a reverse of this diagram. You see governments and you see corporations setting the agenda, and then the rest of us kind of fighting for crumbs at the end. But to the question, what should our future look like? Should governments who are, naturally, you all, I think most of you are civil servants, governments that are constrained in their creativity, what they can do. We have so many checks and balances on how we can operate. Should we be the ones asking this question and setting that agenda? Or should we ask our activists with their superpower of moral clarity and courage? Should we ask our artists and our creatives with their radical imaginations to first define that for us? And then perhaps we think, okay, well, what are paths, what are ways to realizing this future? And then we get, our grassroots groups, our researchers, our knowledge workers, bringing their own, you can get the community groups, their generosity, their creativity, the intellectual rigor to then sort of help us map those paths. And then we bring companies and governments to the table on our terms. So this is something I've been thinking a lot about, and where and how this happens. I'm not sort of going to go into the slide more carefully. This is a theory, I guess, of collaboration and co-creation that I've been thinking about. But the point here, I think, is that we all have different superpowers. And right now, the power is far too much invested in the right side of this. And I think, importantly, we need to create different spaces to do this work. Because right now, so much of what's happening is we have people with economic and political power defining the spaces, setting the agenda, and then the rest of us have to line up. And then the starting point is always too narrow. So where and how are the spaces to fight for structural justice, for radical change? And if you think this is utopian and far out and impossible, my home country of Taiwan, I think, provides a really good example around how this can be done. And now, I think, I'm not sure how familiar folks are with the politics of Taiwan, but in the last year, we have had a minuscule amount of deaths because there has been such effective collaboration across government, with private sector sort of setting up all sorts of innovation, civil society coming together to develop apps and do analysis. And there's been this culture geared towards whole of society collaboration. And this is not something we're seeing everywhere, as we know. And yet at the same time, I think this model is absolutely essential given where we are right now. Because I don't know how many folks remember this quote from last year. Arundhati Roy, in about, I want to say April, published this incredible piece in FT talking about the pandemic as a portal. And I'm sure many of us are sick of hearing that analogy. But at the time, about 1 year ago, she wrote, historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine our world anew. This one's no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through this portal, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred and our dead ideas, or we can walk through lightly, with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. Now, these were beautiful words a year ago. And now I think, as we've all seen what's been happening in India, and her latest essays and dispatches from India have been devastating and heartbreaking. And to me, as someone who dreams about the future and tries to fight for the future that I want, it's been a really hard few months. A year ago, we were seeing, these were the types of news that we were seeing mostly out of Europe, actually, but around the world. We were suddenly, because public health meant universal security, as it were, we were suddenly pushing all these progressive policies. We suddenly were housing the homeless. We were giving refugees rights. We were coming together in solidarity and saying the dignity of all people matter. And progressives cheered. But now what we see, as I understand, almost none of these policies, maybe some of the donut economic stuff is sticking, but for the most part, this is not moving forward. And certainly in the US, what we're seeing, and I think in other places, we have a more divided world than ever. I don't know if y'all saw this, but the biggest predictor of whether or not these men, and they were largely white men across the US that chose to storm the Capitol on January 6th, the biggest predictor of whether they would do that is whether they came from counties with the biggest growth in non-white populations over the previous years. And so I'll wrap up in a minute, but basically, it's hard to see, this is from Edelman, the sort of PR sort of comms agency. It's difficult to see where and how we create these spaces to come together. You see sort of the dimensions of trust, who we see as competent and ethical. Government, I work with media, I work with nonprofits, we're mostly on sort of this end of things. No institution seems to be seen as both competent and ethical. And that's incredibly dangerous given the divided and hostile world we live in. And yet, I think there's incredibly exciting opportunities actually to push for change right now. Some of you all may be familiar with citizens' assemblies and other deliberative mechanisms where we bring citizens together to deliberate on issues of public importance. Y'all may know sort of the legalization of abortion in Ireland was sort of decided as a result of a citizens' assembly. They're being run on a variety of issues. People come together from demographic and ideological diversity to deliberate on key issues. And, this is, I think Europe is where all of these innovations are happening. On this side of the pond, I'm incredibly jealous. We've had high profile climate assemblies in the UK and in France. But I think a key challenge with them, and this is where perhaps it'd be interesting to discuss, there's still many challenges and there's many issues. There's a lot of mistrust that they are simply another tool for governments and for heads of state to push their own agendas and to capture them. And so when I think back to my own experiences with libraries and others, I think about what, in that missing part of the 2x2, like right here, what are the institutions that are seen as trusted and competent? And where can we have these spaces for collaboration, for debate, for discourse? And everyone has a good library story. And I loved digging into all the data on sentiments and attitudes around libraries. I'm sure this is old news to you. It was exciting to me. So I guess my question is, can libraries help foster democratic renewal? The amount of trust is high. The amount of belief that libraries contribute to a sense of communities, that they're critical spaces for gathering to address challenges, it's much higher, I think, than sort of, almost all the institutions that we're seeing. And certainly here in Brooklyn, where I am, the nights that we have, this is a night of philosophy run by the Brooklyn Public Library, where we come together to debate philosophy and ideas and politics, to have, at 3 a.m., people be gathered there in packed rooms in the middle of the night. This is, I think, a 12-hour festival, closing our eyes to listen to poetry and to debate Hobbes, because Hobbes should be debated. I think this is beautiful and exciting, and to me, a sort of glimmer of what libraries can do and where and how we can sort of fit it into the opportunities for renewal that we see. And so these are just some of my reflections and ideas. And I think, there's so many public reckonings happening everywhere right now. And I'm so curious as to where and how you see opportunities for fostering the kind of discourse that we need. And thank you so much for having me. I think the data on the libraries was US. That was Pew Research data.
Thank you so much, Panthea. I'm going to ask as many of you to put your cameras on as you can bear, unless you're in your pajamas or having your dinner. It's a bit early for that. And I'm just going to dive in with a few questions, and then I'm just going to really encourage you to start putting stuff in the chat, and I'm going to ask Teen to put in some stuff as well. I mean, I can't lie, Panthea, like I say, about halfway through that talk, I was feeling pretty depressed, and I was kind of like, holy shit, it's like, us and whose army kind of thing. And so I'm really glad you brought it around to libraries at the end. But then I was thinking it's so interesting that, I think we all feel that kind of gap between institutions and the people. And it's funny because public libraries are kind of institutions, and we are part of government as well. And I was sort of thinking about that tension, and that was where some of my activist stuff came from, because I think depending on the country and the person, some librarians feel quite constrained in terms of what they can do. I think the question that you finished with about can libraries foster democratic renewal is why we're here. And I think we all think the answer is yes, but then the question is how. We feel it as a conviction, but we're asking ourselves how. I love this sort of competent and ethical thing, and I think that part of the how for us is that we don't feel competent yet. And when you lay out this kind of societal decay, I feel like I'm not competent to make my own breakfast, never mind about solve breakdown in the world kind of thing.
Right.
So and I think it's quite interesting how it depends on the country and the environment. Public libraries have been stepping in a huge amount into the social arena, and often without financial support or without training. And that's a kind of, interesting about where the limits are of where we want to play in that thing. And I think we're not used to setting an agenda or feeling like we can. And I think that's quite interesting. And I also love, I'm going to invite people in the chat while we're just kind of exchanging a little bit. I only came across the term, what is your superpower, a few years ago. And I love that. And I'd love people to write in the chat, what they think their library superpower is, or, what our superpowers are. Like me, I know that one of my superpowers is bringing people together, and I love doing that. And it just makes me super happy. And I think it's good sometimes to think about that. I think, what am I really, really good at? And so what is the USP of the public library in this situation? Mm-hmm. And, it's something we've been thinking about in terms of the democracy work that we've started to do is what makes it more than just a space? Mm-hmm. What's different about hosting? So you have that fantastic picture of the, Brooklyn Public Library, super, what makes that special? Instead of it being held in a town hall or in a hotel lobby or in a Museum. I don't know. What's the library's superpower special sauce there? And we don't have Pew in Europe, much to our sadness, so we love all those data, but we can't really use them.
Mhm.
So, I mean, maybe if you could just develop a little bit on that kind of specificity.
Yeah,
What's
sure.
the how, or what's that specificity of the space
Yeah.
for you?
Um, I mean, so I think for me, yeah, and I recognize all the data is sort of biased here, but I think what's special for me is that one, I've been doing advocacy work for some time, and I think, and I know sort of you have as well, and others here, I'm sure. Something that I'm really nervous about right now, as I'm seeing the trajectory of how "quote unquote" activism is happening, is I think often we are now at a point where we're yelling at each other through the media, and I see myself as a facilitator, as a mediator. I bring people together that often hate one another, typically activists and governments, to work on things. And right now, it's hard to get people to come to the table and have good faith conversations, because
Yeah,
we have, big tech has created this sort of horror show where we're kind of just like lobbing insults, fishing for likes, all the sort of critiques of social media that we have. And I think that what is happening there is that we no longer want to, I think activists are winning policy wins. But as we all know, policy wins can be blocked in a million ways in the implementation process. And so you have activists that are saying, we won this legislative thing, but at the same time, those never actually end up going through. So I think about how, outside of yelling at each other through the media,
hmm
what are different ways of activism, quiet activism? I love the work that the craftivists, look them up if you haven't, are doing in the UK. What does quiet activism for introverts look like? And how do we actually call people to the table and call them in instead of calling them out? And perhaps this is some of my romanticism around libraries, I don't know, but I think that many of the spaces where I'm facilitating, yeah, they might be at City Hall, they might be in a sort of glass towered UN room somewhere, they might be in an NGO space, and I think that I see my job as experience design. How do I bring people together to co-create in a space? And how do I try and strip away as much as possible? It's never totally possible. The markers of bias and of power in that space. So when I get to host something in, like, say, a UN building or a World Bank building, like, already, some people that enter have their hackles up, right?
hmm
You go to a corporate hotel, it has a different feeling. You walk into a library, like, there is a different feeling, there's I think there's a history, and again, maybe this is romanticism, but I think there's a history and the weight and the knowledge and the pursuit and the sort of public sharing and sort of all of these, like, notions of it that I don't think we should diminish, in terms of what our unique proposition is, like the
hmm
feeling that people have when they walk into a space. And I think a lot about how do we actually try and balance power dynamics in terms of how I facilitate, who gets to speak, what are the exercises, but the space is everything. The space is
hmm
everything because it can spark imagination, it can temper it down, it can, so I think there's
Mm.
something there. And then the last quick thing, and I'd love some people jump in because I see things in the chat, but I think I also, I mentioned this to you before, and I didn't have time to mention it in the presentation, but I've done a lot of ethnographies of public institutions. And so I know that what we're talking about here, the ideas and probably the realities of what you all have to live with and fight through on
hmm
a day-to-day basis cannot be easy.
hmm
To be sort of, civil servants that want to spark imagination with all the um, baggage and hurdles and red tape of
hmm
public bureaucracies is incredibly hard, and I'm incredibly empathetic and admiring.
hmm
And I think that, what I see now in my space, certainly, so I don't know what that means within your world, because we can talk about procurement and legal frameworks and HR policies and whatever might be helpful. But what I do see is in my space, we are looking for these spaces we are looking, and sometimes we're like, well, universities, but universities, like we're looking for these spaces. And I think there's more and more money and intent and interest of how do we mediate social conflict? How do we mediate political dialogue? How do we have these expansive conversations that come with money and people that want to jump in? Mm-hmm. And yet the debate we're having is like, but who can do that? Who can host this for us? Mm-hmm. Who can be a representative of neutral ground that is fertile for debate? And so when you reached out, I was like, libraries. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah.
I mean, I want to open. Please put your virtual hands up if you want to say something, and I'd like to take a real round of comments, questions, and thoughts. So I'm counting on a few of you to do that. I definitely want to go to Evdoxia, who's put quite a lot in the chat there. If you don't mind speaking, we can't see you, but I can see that you're chatting. Stefani, I think that's your first name, right?
Yeah, my first name is Evdoxia. I'm from Greece.
Evdoxia, okay. Could go either way for that one.
Yeah.
I think something that jumps out for me, Panthea, when you're just saying that as well, is just like, I love that you're saying that. I don't think we're feeling that clamoring for this from people necessarily yet. So I see, Eric, you've got your hand up. I'll come to you next. But Evdoxia, please say something.
Well, the thing that I wanted to say is that there's a lot of debate internationally right now about democracy, especially in the US, but in other countries as well, especially after what has happened with COVID and all the mandatory things that we had to endure from our governments that were on the fringes of democratic processes like lockdowns and stuff like that. So there is a large discussion about what is democratic and what's not. So there is a debate about strengthening democratic institutions and how we can do that through libraries, because it's very important. I'm from the National Library of Greece. We have been fortunate to be funded by the Stavros Niarchos Foundation that is very active in the US right now, building agoras for the discussion of democracy and other institutions and things. So we are, and being from Greece, I guess, we are a little bit sensitive about democracy and what exactly that entails. And in a very international environment, when everything is interpreted differently, I mean, like activism that somebody wrote, that's very different in the US and very different in Europe, very different in Greece. We have not a very strong, but we do have a communist party. So it's a very, very different thing what activism means in every context. So there are a lot of things that we do take for granted or like common sense, but they're not in an international context. So maybe we should just work together and see where everybody is, identify the issues in every country, see in a continuum, exactly in a democratic continuum, I would say, or an information access continuum, which is very, very important for democratic institutions to survive, and see where exactly we can work together and make our libraries agoras, so that we can start a discussion about information, about democratic institutions, about how can we revive our societies after this pandemic and after this very frightful experience that we went through the last 2 years. So that's what I want to do.
I mean, I think we're all really aware that the word demos is a Greek origin word as well. I see Eric, and then I wanted to call, if they don't mind, on Mark and Chris. I talked to you guys earlier as well, just hearing from that Go ahead, Eric. You're unmuted.
Can you all hear me or not?
You need to speak up.
Thank you. Speak up. Louder
Speak
than
up.
this. Okay. And Panthea, thank you so much. Really good stuff.
Thank you for having me.
And I think in the chat, you have to read the chat maybe later on.
Yeah.
Libraries always tend to go to, yes, but we have to give access to information. Access to information, that's what we're good at. But access is just a handle on the door and it stops there. We need to do way more than providing access. It's good to be proud, but it starts there. Our bloody job starts by giving access. It's a natural thing to provide access, how difficult it may be. It starts after that. And when I was working with and talking to one of your US colleagues, Deborah Lavoie, Louise Lavoie, and she built realityteam.org. I don't know if you heard about it, but check it out, because I think this is something that relates to library work. Realityteam.org. She's a marketeer, and she saw all the fake news and the filter bubbles and the people being scared and everything. And she said, we need to do something about it. And she built a platform. She actually started buying sort of counter narratives on Facebook. So she started to provide ads with real information countering the other narratives. And this is something that we don't do, that I know much of in libraries, that we can do more. I think we provide reading tables, we provide all the newspapers, the magazines, but there's hardly, in the Netherlands, hardly ever anyone sitting down with these people, talking to them and asking them, why do you get these crazy ideas from that there is a conspiracy to do this or to do that or whatever, you know? And I think that's basic librarian services that we should provide. We should sit down with people, talk to them, listen to them, disagree in a respectful way. We don't have to agree on anything. That's not going to happen. But let us disagree and part waving, saying goodbye in a friendly way. So you set me thinking again, Panthea. Thank you so much. Maybe I don't have an actual real question, but you set me thinking again. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Panthea, I'm going to keep going on the comments for a moment, and I hope that's okay. I'm not going to give you too much in one go, but I'd just like to kind of hear what people are saying. Chris, can I dig into your brain for a moment?
It's tempting to say no, you can't.
The empty vessel that we all are.
Much has been said, but I've been thinking a bit about what was in the chat about the superpowers of library. I kind of had the feeling that Eric started well with saying trust. And I think it's true that most of his libraries are trusted, but what is even more important that is also that we are so very local based, and that local communities really recognize us as part of their environment, even people who mistrust other public institutions. And I think a third superpower is perhaps that we are humble. And you could even see that in the chat, and that's a big difference with, for example, arts institutions, which are mostly not humble, which mostly think about how can we make ourselves as important as we can be, due to the fact that they mostly have to be funded in that way. But that are very important things, and I think also that this gives us great responsibility. When I got a bit depressed, as you did also, Ilona, when I got all these figures and the distrust in government. So I think, yeah, we have a great responsibility, and we also have a great history, because libraries, public libraries, have always been there for the emancipation of people. So in the chat, there was a lot to do about is access our superpower? Is access a starting point, or what is it? I think it's just a starting point which helps people also to give this trust to this local this local place where people can go for that. But now it's much more about the digitization, the technological revolution which is taking place, and people do not know, they do not understand the world anymore. And I think a lot of the distrust, democratic distrust, also comes from that fact. It's not just about demographics. It's not just about sociological evolutions. It's also that the world is changing through this technological revolution. And I think always having been there for emancipation of people, that we have to take a stand in helping people to better understand the world and help them understand how this technological revolution is changing everything and is changing their lives. Without they know it's just a feeling that people have. And so I think that libraries can play an important role over there. Is that an activist role? You know, I don't really care about how you call it. But I think definitely there's a huge role that libraries can take there, starting from their superpowers, helping people to understand the world as it is changing now, and this way also serving the democracy in our countries.
What's occurring to me is also, you know, Alfonso said something in the chat about, you know, we need skills for this, and I currently feel there's two big gaps. You know, one is confidence and skills to do this on a scale that's going to make a difference, which is obviously what we're all working together now. And the other gap that really jumps out to me is that Panthea is not alone. And she's not the only one that's thinking about this stuff at a very high level. And I'm having the feeling that there's a huge amount of demand out there, but the libraries are not connecting with that. And my overwhelming experience in the 7 years I've been doing this work is that almost every time I went to somebody who was looking for spaces, they had never once thought of using a public library. Not once. You know, and I would come in and say, did you know there are all these fantastic spaces? That's such a good idea. Why didn't I think about that? But, oh yeah, there's all this great stuff that I'm having at my local library. And I'm like, yeah, well, you're spending millions of dollars on healing societies and you're not plugging into the public library network, investing in the public library and, you know, bringing this up to capacity. And I've had a very challenging experience in a country recently where, you know, it was actually the opposite, you know, where the people we were asking to use the library, and I know the libraries in this town are awful. I never want to work with them. They, you know, I knock on the door and they say no, you know, and it's like, you know, there's still that kind of feeling there as well. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to ping back to Panthea because there's quite a lot that's been said there. And then I want to go to Nicola and Mark, and then anybody else who wants to jump in. Stephen, you're writing loads in the chat. If you actually want to speak, then shout. If not, I'm going to keep going. But back to you for a moment, Panthea, just to wrap up this round, and then we'll take another round of thoughts and comments.
I mean, I thought all of that was brilliant, so I don't know if I have anything to add, but maybe just a couple of quick reflections on points that have been made. Yeah, I think absolutely agree with Doxia. I think activism can feel like such a fraught word lately, and also people don't identify with activism. I think we were talking about sort of the stereotypical sort of activist and what we think, like, you know, fists in the air. And there's a role for that, and there's a place for that. But I think a lot of what is broken and why we're not getting structural wins that are then implemented is because that is the image. I mentioned quickly, but I encourage you all to look up her, I think she did a TED Talk. It's Sarah Corbett. I'll type it in the chat, Sarah Corbett, and she started this organization called Craftivists. And the really quick thing is she basically talks about being an activist, a campaigner, at a music festival in the UK. And she has locked herself in one of those porta potties. This is how her talk starts. She's locked herself in one of those porta potties, which I'm sure everyone knows are absolutely filthy, because she is just terrified of her job, because we think activism is yelling at people and getting to the sign your thing and do all this. So she started this thing, Activism for Introverts, which is how do you get people, introverts, and she's like, these are, you know, we live in a world that celebrates extrovertism, if that's a word. Since Susan Cain wrote Quiet, maybe we're seeing sort of, you know, some of the values of introverts, which is like, you know, we're thoughtful, we ask deep questions, we probe harder, we don't just like the one catchy slogan that's on the sign. And so she started this thing with these craftivist collectives where people come together to knit, to crochet, to do sort of different crafts. And then they come together to sort of talk about like activisty topics. What do we want to change? What do we want our world to be like? You know, whatnot. And I think what's brilliant about that is she's like, you know, it suits us. We don't like to make eye contact, so we get to look at our crafts. We get to have these long, deep conversations over these sessions, and they've had some tremendous wins. They campaigned Marks and Spencer, the big sort of retailer in the UK, to raise minimum wage. And you know how they did that? By taking a humble approach. They showed up at the board meetings when there were a bunch of angry people outside that were like with the signs and yelling like, you know, you pigs, like raise minimum wage. And they show up with like, they're like, hello, sir. Like, we have these cute little handkerchiefs that we've knitted. Could we come in and speak to your board members and give this to them? And the handkerchiefs had like a sun on it that said like, do the right thing, and a rainbow. It was like, everybody matters. And I think the board was just like, what is this? Like, what do you know? They got access, they got the in, they ended up sort of, you know, counting this as one of their wins. And I think there's so many different ways to look at activism that's culturally sort of appropriate, that is sort of suited to, you know, individual, you know, and I think, you know, just going to where and how these meetups happen. Yeah, so that's just kind of one. I think leaning into, you know, what your superpower is and the trust aspect of it, I do think, for better or worse, that I think think of government as a monolith. I think libraries, I would venture, I haven't looked deep into the methodology, are probably seen outside of that. I think people are not always that well, you know, I think you understand sort of the difference that I'm talking about. And I think that, and I think it's really interesting to think about, you know, what does a humble approach to convening and activism and dialogue look like? And it could be that, you know, you all have your own agenda, you know, that you want to sort of promote in terms of what libraries do, and also could serve as a platform for people in my space. Because, and just one last quick anecdote around the technological revolution. I've been working with the Wikimedia Foundation for the last few years. They are the group behind Wikipedia. And, you know, so global top 10 website, have had a huge debate around what their movement strategy should be moving forward. And historically, I think to Eric's point, they're like, well, access is enough. How do we make sure everyone around the world has access? Because Wikipedia is mostly written by well-educated men that are largely in rich countries. So they thought, okay, how do we both get people in the global South and elsewhere access, but how do we help them represent and write their histories? How do we decolonize open knowledge if our mission is truly, we want to live in a world where every human being has access to the sum of the world's knowledge? That's their mission. That is audacious, that is big. And so they've gone through this whole global movement strategy exercise to think, you know, how do we use new technologies? How do we use our platform? But also, at the end of the day, I think they started from saying we're a website to we are a political movement. We're a political movement that believes in these things, that believes in knowledge equity, that believes in knowledge as a platform. And they've totally sort of re-shifted how they think about themselves from infrastructure and access to political movement and equity. And so I think that's just kind of interesting to think about. Yeah,
I think that's a really interesting question for us as we build this going forward, because we have talked about a kind of a movement, and again, back to where the freedom is, you know, these are public administrations, these are public librarians. There's definitely an obligation to be broad, you know, in terms of approach. And I'm kind of curious if within, you know, the 65,000 public library spaces, one of the things that we've been talking about with this democratic process we want to get onto is developing a shared language that we all feel that we can adopt and engage with, and, you know, make that work in a reasonable way. I want to give the floor quickly to Nicola, who's here from the European Cultural Foundation, who's doing a really interesting program there. And I'm sure you've got some interesting thoughts to share, Nicola. And then I'd really like to pick up on the two questions that are in, or the two comments in the chat, the one from Mark. And also I just think, Philippa, you're so on the mark with this question about democracy. And I think we're talking about it in this very abstract way, and I totally, but I just wonder if I'm becoming old and cynical, really. So if I could go to Nicola, and then I'm just going to read out Mark's question. I'm sure you can all see it in the chat, but I'll do that just for clarity, and then then I'm going to give the floor back to you, Philippa. If you want to just reiterate in person, that'd be great, and then I think we'll start moving to wrapping up. So Nicola, not Olga as it says on your thing.
Yeah, I'm logging in with my colleagues' details being very confusing. Thanks so much. That was amazing to listen to all and read all of your comments. I just launched with my colleague Olga and with Ilona, who's a partner with us, and Democratic Society, we've just launched a project piloting how working with libraries and facilitating them to facilitate their local communities on working on a specific challenge. Hello to some of you who are here. I see Daggers here and Aline and probably others. So we just launched on the 9th of May. I've just put if you want to know a bit more about it, I put the link in the chat. And essentially we're piloting to see how libraries can mobilize their communities and ask their communities if they have a shared challenge that they would like to work on around a democratization process. So it could be about women and technology or public health or homelessness, having access to use libraries. And they are working on with those communities who are self-deciding the challenge, the communities. And we are also giving additional funds to those local communities so we can allow them to have money to spend in order to try and solve the challenge they have identified. And then we're going to do an award next year to highlight the most successful or the most impactful challenges that were created. And we're hoping that this turns into an annual or a repeated event, and that we can scale up the amount of libraries. Right now we're working 7, and looking at how we can mobilize libraries to then be able to be self-organizing with their communities in making local change, which could be replicable on a European level as well. So everything you're saying here is very motivating for me in relation to the work we've done.
That's
Thanks so much, Ilona.
Well, I'm really so delighted that ECF's taken the plunge and is investing actual real time and money and mentoring into kind of very deep process. And, it's a gift. It's a gift for all of us. I'm not sure I understand your comment, Mark, but I'm going to try and break it down here. So the question was, how can we build up civic skills for citizens in libraries? And I'm wondering if that kind of speaks to a little bit that what Philippa was saying as well, is that we have maybe different ideas about what civic values are or civic skills are. And it's something we've talked about with Marie from Aarhus in Denmark as well, is sometimes when democracy is a real turn off for a lot of people as a word. I talked to a librarian group that's working a lot in the Global South, and they're like, there's 50% of African countries, there's no way we would use this word in a program for libraries. I'm like, okay. A lot of people understand it as, voting, et cetera, et cetera. And I think we talked about this question of cultivating, a culture of participation in society. And that's also this kind of idea of, I think that might be a little bit, like showing up, but with what values and with what skills, because you need society we need a culture that allows us to join and participate. And if what we've experienced is that every time we join and participate, we are ignored, refused, denied, or underserved in some ways, that, this kind of reinforcing negative experience. And, which is paradoxical, because we know that we're battling a massive epidemic of loneliness in Europe as well. And I feel that one of the USPs, and I'm going to come back to the end, is about this thing about space. So I'm not sure if you can speak to his question, so what do you say here, Mark? It's not really it's not endorsed in practical terms by some political sides. Do we risk importing the battlefield into libraries? Okay, I'm going to go to you first, Panthea, on that, and then I'm going to ask Philippa to come in afterwards, because I'm trying to unpick that as an idea. Thanks for really a complicated question, Mark.
No, it's a really excellent question, and I don't know that I can do it justice. But a few thoughts on that. I think there is absolutely a risk that is very real of just importing the battlefield if we are not intentional about design. I think humans are products of our world. Spaces are products of our world. We live in a violent, oppressive, greedy, late stage capitalist society that, tells us the path to sort of happiness is to buy more stuff. I live in New York, where it is extreme, because, how does a rich country get richer? You get, by making us feel anxious about all the things that we don't have, that we aren't, so that we buy more products. And so we consume our way to happiness. And it's no wonder that people are more lonely. I think Geographic mobility is higher here than I think in sort of many other places. And so people feel very, I think, detached from community. And I think just in my mutual aid group in this last year, I think what's been incredible is that people have loved calling their neighbors, asking what groceries they need, going to the store, doing the shopping for them, dropping it off. It's really fostered a sense of connection. And so going to the sort of civic values, like, and sorry, these thoughts are going to be messy, but going to the civic values, I think, yeah, democracy has become a dirty word. I think I think the democratic innovation field, it's seen as white liberal elites, which is like not a good look. That is, very, I think, dissociated from the rest of the world and from questions of power and politics. We can't talk about democracy in just technical terms, which I think is what a lot of that space has turned it into. And if we think, just going to democratic capture and capitalism, I think that, we have folks that have been told for so long, your duty as a citizen is just to come up and vote every 4 years, and then it's done. Otherwise, you pay attention to Brad and Angelina, to the Kardashians, to whatever. And so, decision-making happens in DC, in Brussels, in London, in Abuja, in, Taipei. And otherwise you don't, and you know what? It's too complicated for you to understand. It's too complicated, and the media is incentivized to coverage conflict. Citizens' assemblies have not been covered very well because journalists say, it's people politely talking with one another, trying to understand nuance and trying to understand other points of views. It doesn't make for good media. We want people to be yelling at each other across the aisle, But I think democracy and, or let's not use democracy. I think civic engagement, like neighborly values, like all that. I think we're hungry for these spaces. And so I think so much of it is going to come down to how do we brand and design these spaces to separate it from the dumpster fire of a world that we all live in. Is there a way to think about I think so much of democracy space too now, like civic participation, Alana, to your point, so many people, after studies show, after they go and participate in traditional civic engagement processes, they're actually more disillusioned, because there are certain ways of talking. Nowadays, participating in a workshop is a professional skill, how to write on a Post-it note, how to hold yourself. And so people from lower classes, from different races, from historically oppressed groups, go there and they realize
they don't know how to do it. They don't know what the language is.
Yeah, this space is not for me. They say they want my voice, but they actually don't. And so could libraries, and could the way that you go about this, be civic participation or community connection or neighborly care or mutual love in a different way? And so much of that space is being done by facilitation. I think we need mediation. I think we need conflict transformation. And I think we need to have deeper and heart-filled, not just head-filled, but heart-filled dialogues in a different way. And I think that takes really intentional design and pushing back. But I don't know, that's just what comes to mind. And I'm reading the comments.
Let me throw it back to Philippa quickly. And I don't want to focus on the negative, but I know that there's, like I say, there's and then I'm going to start to wrap up. So I just feel that what I really want to avoid with these conversations is a kind of self-congratulatory thing where we're all going, "Aren't libraries great?" And is it, and of course we know that, but this is a group that knows that and works with libraries all the time. And this is also a group that's doing amazing stuff with libraries, in amazing different ways. And just for a moment to just sort of think about, I love what Svetlana just put in there as well about, what the fears are for us about being too radical, what our fears are about not, you're talking about doing something that is both not rocket science, but requires delicacy and nuance and competence and experience. You're talking about a group of stakeholders who have different relationships with public libraries. And like I say, we're missing something in connecting, and that's a question I'd like you to think about at the end, is what do you what do you really need from libraries to be doing more than being receptive to a request from you? And then the final kind of barrier that we might be facing in sort of the transformational thing is the thing that Filipa talks about, which is whether people are actually interested or motivated. Filipa, do you want to expand on that at all, or are you happy with that?
Yeah, no, I can. It's just I'm a bit like you. I'm thinking, and I don't have answers, of course, but I think it's interesting this moment also, because it's like a bit of a crossroad, no? Because on one hand, there's tension, there's a social tension that brings people to action. But it can also bring other people to the reverse. They can be more numb because everything is overwhelming, and they then consume more, and they have all this, we all have these two paths, no? Or we go to a more active way, or we go to a less active way. And I think libraries, in a sense, they can be places to motivate people to action, and this doesn't need to be immediately through activism in a very direct form. Sometimes we can also, in the sense that we bring people to the experience of being together and being present and being not numb and not all by ourselves, no? Just this is very important. But I was thinking also, because of the first question you made, why were library spaces so valued? And I think that brings us to the tradition of library spaces. Libraries have created a feeling of comfort and a feeling of safety. And I think that is regarded to or related to the fact that you can go in to a library, or you could, and not be very disturbed. You could go with your ideas. You were not obliged to reply to any message immediately. Like, for example, in museums, we know that we have mediation, we have so many stimulus, and that we have to respond. But maybe libraries, they're open in that sense that you can go in, you can get your books, or you can study, you can think, and no one will mess with you. And that is something that is very valuable that we got. But that doesn't mean that we have to stop and just be that and don't expand. We have to expand and also be places that invite to activism positions and to social debate and to civic participation, like maker spaces of civic participation. Why not? But also there's not the risk, but there might be the consequence that we are changing the space. We're changing the way people will feel the space. So it's interesting.
There's a lot of resistance to that as well.
Yeah, and there's a lot of resistance. Yeah, but maybe resistance does not come from the I don't know, from the right motives. I think there's always this balance that on one hand we have a precious thing, which is places that really can have this potential to bring people together and to make them feel safe. On the other hand, we have to move forward, and we have to be able to create more than that, because it is a problem. This association of so many people with democracy processes is a problem, of course.
Okay, I don't want to stop, but I feel we're going to have to get there. I'm going to give the word to Juha, who put his hand up. If anybody else is burning to say something, you're absolutely welcome. Put your virtual hand up or just write something in the chat so I can see that you really do want to speak. Juha, you have the floor for a moment.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Panthea, for the inspiring presentation and for everyone to all the comments. This might sound like trivial, but of course the role of public libraries, they vary a lot in different countries and contents. Yeah, that's for sure. But it should not be when a library is a community center, it should not be a social aid. So that has to be separated somehow. So the reputation and role would be still focused in education and democracy, not social aid. And I think that one of the superpowers of libraries or librarians is the reputation. So this humbleness that Alfonso mentioned should be put aside. And again, yeah, libraries should not be battlefields either. So I think that at the same time, it has to be taken care of that wealthy or middle-class people still think that libraries are essential. The word. Essence, you know what I mean?
Essential, yeah.
Essential, yeah. Sorry.
No.
So this outreach work, marketing to these groups that are not doing so good, and still marketing to those middle class and wealthy people. That's one of the keys, I think. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to start wrapping up, Panthea. I'm going to come back to you. We've covered so much, and I've got a few thoughts as well, but you go ahead. Tell me if there's something you'd just like to finally... I think you mentioned when we were prepping this, and I hadn't really come across the idea of what an ethnography was. What would it take for you to do an ethnography of the public library sector, and what would that look like? And what do you want from us?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I find institutional ethnographies fascinating because we always have what we say, we want, and then there's the actual practical nuts and bolts too operationally around how things happen. I think it's also fascinating to have the big blue sky ideas and then drill down into legal frameworks and procurement policies and all the regulations and whatnot to find sort of where they intersect. And also then and I think at the end of the day, I always think of the unit of change as humans, as individual humans. And so if people are constrained in what they can do from regulations, from whatnot, then that crushes their spirit. We see this a lot in bureaucracies, which is why I think like ethnographic work and looking at institutional ethnographies is really fascinating as a sort of like a mechanism for change. And I also think to like, what do we need? Training, money, partnerships, I think that this might sound too like flip or simplistic, but I think so often what I see when there's I work with a lot of like movements, so like open knowledge movement, democracy movement, progressive movement. And I think what often happens is we spend a lot of time just like debating who we are and what we should be, and we never really agree. And so we kind of spend a lot of time sort of in circles, which is not a bad thing. Like debate and discourse and deliberation is great. But I think sometimes we sort of let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And how do we pick one or two things, and I hate thinking of like low hanging fruit, but like what are one or two things that we all agree on that we want to do, and not think of it as I think there are questions around, what if we're too radical? How do we appeal to our existing base? How do we, as you have said, make sure that, communities that we've traditionally served are not overlooked? And I think we sort of debate these as, well, do we do this or that? Is it 1 or 0? And I don't think of it that way. I think especially when we're doing new things, I think we have to think about our work like as taking a portfolio approach of sorts. So, maybe us coming together, maybe 60% of our energy, because also we're tired, we're underfunded or whatnot, 60% of our energy is just going to do like what we already do. Maybe 10%. Just for now is going to be the radical out there, like democratic renewal, whatnot stuff. Maybe 20% is going to be, whatever it is. But if we can agree around what our values that we can all agree to, and I think someone said, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. Like, I think, like what are the values that we can agree to? The world is changing. And I think as someone who also, I think when I was they always say, like, when you're younger, you're more sort of radical. When you're older, you're more conservative. I feel like I come from a very humble background where I'm like, I don't know the answer. I grew up under military rule. We were taught not to question politics, taught not to question governance. I think I get more radical as I get older because I'm like, I've tried these things. They don't work. And I see how the humility has like hurt me in the past around not calling out the things that I know were really wrong and sort of, you know, expecting that big institutions had the answer. So I don't know that that's a sort of good answer for any of this, but I do think that starting from like a superpowers or a capabilities-based approach, what are we excellent at? What are 1-2 things that we can agree on that we want to fight for together? How do we not frame it as, oh my God, this is going to be everything that we do, but it's maybe just 10, 20, whatever percent of what it is that we do. And yeah, because I think just to Philippa's point, there's so much societal healing that needs to happen right now. There's so much healing. There's so much expansion of imagination that needs to happen. And from everything that you all have told me and some of the data that I was digging into when I was preparing for this, the association, the imagination, the romanticism with libraries, I don't think that should be, you know, overlooked. I think that's a huge source of strength and power. So just some reflections.
Nice. Well, thank you so much, Panthea. I just, you know, I think we could all talk to you for quite a long time. And there's so much we haven't been able to hear from you in terms of all of the things that you're doing. I think we can find you at Reboot. Is that where you put your website in there? I think we put it in the advertisement, but just to remind people, you said quite early, you use something called synergy and sparks, and I love that as a kind of metaphor for what we're looking for. I think that's great. And also that the space is everything, and that's something that we really want to leverage. So I just can't thank you enough for your time and your enthusiasm, and it's great. You know, I feel that we need to connect with all of our fantastic library lovers around the world who don't work in libraries and who will help us achieve the goals that we want to achieve. For all of you here, I want to remind you that next week we have the amazing Jean Tan from Singapore, who is just a revelation, and he is doing an experiment to fail that is fascinating, and I really think we're going to learn a lot from him. You might be hearing from us as we finish promoting 60 Books for the Summer. We'll be asking you to get in touch with some of the MEPs, and we're going to be coming back to you because we're probably not going to do Generation Code in the autumn as we have done, but we're thinking about, COVID permitting, whether we might have a physical meetup of us in one way or another in Brussels that would be combined with something to do with the European Parliament, something to do with this topic. So, you know, probably in November. So we just want to let you know that we're working on that. And as you know, certainly as many of us that can travel would just be so fun. I think it's coming up for nearly 2 years that we haven't been in the same room together as a network. And, you know, would just be so fantastic to see you all. I'm delighted you've all stayed the whole time. It's such an active and engaged group. I'm super proud of you all, and it's been lovely to see you all. Please email me if you've got other thoughts and follow-ups. I'm sure that, you know, I can pass stuff on to Panthea if it seems interesting, you want to get in touch with her. And I wish you, Panthea, a wonderful day, and everybody else across Europe a wonderful evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Such a joy to see and talk to you all. Thank you.